Hello, my name is Kaiyra.
Kendy.
And Xavier.
Has time changed? Are we better or worse? In other states, there is still slavery, even if there is not slavery in the United States. Slavery ended in 1865 in the United States, but in other countries, it is still happening. It is ending little by little. Moral growth and moral dilemma have been changing over the years. In the 19th century, moral growth was not something people thought about. Now, more and more people think about it.
Moral dilemma was talked about in the 19th century, and ever since it has been changing. The LGBT is getting more support from people. The LGBT is getting support because people are beginning to understand why there is an LGBT group and that they are the same.
How has time changed from the 19th century to now? Slavery started in 1619 and got bigger as time passed by 1960. There was more than 2 million slaves that were beat and forced into slavery to plant crops for them, such as tobacco and cotton. They were also often accused for crimes they didn't do. Most of them were usually found guilty and ended up dying. Slavery ended in 1865. Even if slavery ended nowadays, some people are still being racist. Even though slavery is ending, slavery is still happening in other states and countries. Even if it is illegal in most countries, they still have it today, like in India.
To the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean. But the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also...
Moral growth and moral dilemma have been changing over time. People only used to think of themselves. In today's world, people now care about each other with respect. In the past, people didn't talk about moral growth.
In the past, moral dilemma was talked about by Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln talked about how people were treating each other and that he wanted to change that. People are now standing up for one another.
The first national gay rights organization was formed in 1951. The first lesbian rights organization in the U.S. was founded in 1955. People thought that they were a disgrace to humans. People would mistreat them and sometimes make them feel bad. Over the past decade, LGBT people have made a legal political gains in the United States and also including the right to marry. Still, some people don't approve. They created an anti-LGBT club. The anti-LGBT club are trying to stop them. So they are making cases and going to court.
People ask, how about now? Times have changed a lot. They are getting better over time. Slavery is still happening in other states and countries, but it is ending little by little. In the beginning, moral growth was not talked about, but now more and more people think about it. Moral dilemma was talked about in the 19th and ever since has been changing. The LGBT is getting more support because people are beginning to understand that they are the same.
We got the information for slavery from www.economictimes.com. The next website we got was for LGBT, www.hrw.org. The last website we used was YouTube.